Flesh and Blood players, thank you for coming on to the channel once again. We are joined today by the esteemed Rhea Adams, on hit effect, master of Icelander, multiple battle-hardened champion, and we are going to be talking about the new Prism today. We have a spoiler from Pheano Black coming out in just a little while, which we are hoping to maybe even catch mid-recording, which would be really funny. But either way, we're going to talk about the new Prism, the strategy that you can take, the strategy you might not want to take, or that you might be having some struggles with, as well as thinking on what Prism could be using or needing in order to see some newfound success in the heavy hitters metagame coming up. Rhea, thank you for coming on the channel.
Hello. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thanks. Yeah, always glad to have. Sorry.
I'm really excited. I really love this hero, and so I'm very excited to get to collaborate and have a chat with, I think, one of the biggest names in terms of Prism deck building.
Yeah, thanks. It's definitely fun to be the Prism boomer coming back out of hibernation when we get some new news. I know that with Dusk Till Dawn, a lot of people were kind of like, Prism, not it currently, but that was when Briar and Lexi and a whole bunch of other characters like Icelander were still around and still really causing a lot of waves in the metagame. So it will be interesting to see what their lack of presence is going to do to us here now. So one of the questions I wanted to get to right off the bat is, what interested you in Prism in her current state? What's your favorite part of Prism, and what made you a fan?
Yeah, so what makes me such a fan of Prism right now is how intricate a lot of the play lines are. I think it really speaks to me. As a player, like, I've tried Guardian before. It's like block 9, attack for 4. I just get bored very quickly. And Prism, between your when are you flipping your figments? When am I blocking with 6 and throwing 1 herald versus committing, no, this is a double herald hand? How am I playing around the potential pop with Phantasmal Footsteps? There's so many divergent play lines compared to a lot of other decks that it really excites me as a player. And it's one of the biggest reasons I've been drawn to the deck. I also, of course, in the first iteration, really enjoyed building that board state consistently every game, because it's not something you really could get in Fab back then. And that's kind of like what initially brought me into playing the hero. Also, I hated Starvo with a passion, and she was the only way to somewhat consistently beat that deck.
Very true. Yeah, it's funny you mention all these things about the play lines and the complexity, because back in Monarch meta, you didn't really have a choice on phantasms or playing around and stuff with the auras. You kind of had to push everything together because you only had so many cards to fit in the deck in the first place. And so for someone who's been playing Prism the whole time, it's funny because these things become second nature, right? On thinking, oh, is it even worth it for me to try and attack here? Because what if I just get popped, right? What's the big blowout scenario where you kind of set yourself up for failure in a way? But now we have a lot more things to consider, especially if we're going from different heroes, and now we have newcomers coming to Prism and Illusionist in general. Because even Andromai is a lot different than Prism, where you're more focused on these allies that aren't super, they're super high value if they don't get popped, right? You have this snowballing advantage that's really easy to take advantage of, and so you have a bit less of that disparity of really low floor but super high ceiling. Whereas now Prism is a bit more capped on that ceiling. So we'll probably be able to get into that momentarily, but you kind of alluded to it already with Starvo and things like that, but what was your starting point with the original Prism? What was your impression and experience with her?
Yeah, so it's a very specific memory for me. So it was the very first weekend of ProQuest Season 1. I was playing Briar, and I was undefeated going into the last round of Swiss. Took my first loss there, so it was second seed going into top 8 or whatever. I had dodged Starvo all tournament, and round 1 of top 8, I sit down across from a Starvo, and I get absolutely stomped, and I'm like, oh, this deck is a problem. And I'm one of the first people eliminated from that tournament, so I walk over and I pull my Cold Foil hero, which was the prize for the top 8s back then, and it was Prism, and I was like, I've heard that the Spectra thing's pretty good. And the rest is kind of history, because it's really funny. You fast forward to 4 weeks after that, the last weekend of ProQuest Season 1, and I am in the finals of a ProQuest playing my Prism versus none other than Charles Dunn's Starvo. And I got there. So that was actually how I qualified for Pro Tour 1, was on original Prism. I played her there as well, and I started the hero as a meta pick, but it really just kind of turned into like one of my first real loves in Flesh and Blood, of course, until Icelander came along.
Yeah, and I think we're kindred spirits in that way, because for me, obviously Prism has been my, one and only since I got into the game, but once I had been learning, to enjoy Flesh and Blood and other aspects as well, Lexi was my next pickup because I thought Ice and Lightning was super cool, and Fusion and all that was super fun. And then, of course, when Icelander came out, I'm like, ooh, more instant speed, more interaction, I love this. And didn't end up playing Icelander in any like real events or anything. I was still playing Prism at the time until she LL'd, and then, et cetera, et cetera. But, we both, I think, enjoy similar aspects to the game from just from judging on how many similar heroes we have in common. So that's fun. So as far as deck building is concerned, right, a big thing that I've always been enjoying for Flesh and Blood is the deck building and brewing process, right? You have a lot of modularity in the way that your cards can work. A lot of things can do double, triple, quadruple, however tuples of duty that you want them to do. And so, and you're no stranger to that with Icelander and all of her blue suite. So I think it's fun to think about as someone like yourself who is credited for being the Arcane Icelander deck architect, like the main, proponent for that style in a Bullander world where everyone's trying to go for those, efficient 2-card 8 type physical and arcane split that Michael Hamilton popularized with his, nationals and world lists. How do you approach deck building, like mentally? Like, where do you start? Are you more of a top-down, bottom-up, equipment first, combos first, etc.? Like, where does your head go with deck building?
Yeah, so where I always start with deck building is I want to identify what's the strongest thing this hero does, and that is only this hero can do, right? And I kind of build from there. So like, for example, Icelander, the strongest thing that hero can be doing is ending the game off of a Storm Striders that's like a blue Emeritus from Arsenal, plus Waning Moon, plus a big spell from hand. And so what kind of led me to Arcane Icelander is enabling the consistency of that game plan. I wanted to be drawing a reasonable arcane spell in essentially every hand. And, I kind of drew lines based on that. Like, well, the red ice arcane spells also contribute to your game plan of like Channelate Frigid to help you survive until that late game, as opposed to something like Bully, which I tried a lot, but I kept drawing red 2 blocks when I needed to pop all with Storm Striders, and I'm like, I am going to lose the game. So when I've been looking at that with Prism, I think the strongest thing this hero can do is throw 2 red heralds in the same turn and supply the opponent or present the opponent with 2 massive on hits. I mean, we're talking about like between 1 and 4 value with each of these herald on hits, and most of the red heralds are red 7 power breakpoints. So like, these are very real questions you're asking your opponent. So just starting with like a handful of figments, the red heralds, all the blue heralds, and just pressing what's the right ratios here in terms of resources to maximize that. Okay, well, do we actually beat popper decks like that, like Bravo? Not really. So how do we address that? The answer is an Iris switchboard, and the deck kind of falls into place from there.
Yeah, it's funny because when Prism dropped Industrial Dawn, I believe Icelander was still around, and that was probably still your main focus at the time. And so it's funny because I remember just pumping out Prism list after Prism list. I couldn't name them in like funny, unique things anymore. They became Prism 1, Prism 2, Prism 3.
Yeah.
And I, got up to like double digits and everything was significantly different, where it's like, okay, this one has, only Luminaris, no aura backup plan. This one's only auras, no Luminaris at all. This one is Talishar. I tried Talishar Prism. Spoiler alert, it actually was kind of better than what we had at the time in the meta. It was not terrible. It's better than Luminaris in some cases, so.
Interesting. Yeah, just having a 1-card hand when you need it, I can kind of see it. I
mean, the funniest thing about it was like, and this is a tangent, by the way, but this is just funny. The like Spears of Surreality, you have a lot of these 1-cost go again cards, Phantasmify, even Mischievous Meeps, right? Life for Life, Scar for Scar. These things you can lead your turn with and then end on like that single herald. And when you're running Empyrean Rapture, you only need to flip it 3 times to get positive value out of your hero ability, and the ward is useful. So I was only running 3 figments at the time, and I was running only like 15 blues, so that's like heralds and some other stuff, to be able to fuel your whole turn of a 3-card play, or a 2-card play with just a herald and a blue, right? And sometimes you can get some extra value. And it turned out that having 0 for 4s in your deck is good. The deck started as being called 4-head because everything was 0 for 4, like defense reactions or scarf for cards, etc. So, you know, that's kind of like the Bullander approach where you're just trying to maximize card per card number rather than going for synergy, right? And so it's not terrible, but I don't think it's where we want to be, right? We definitely want to be using our own cards.
My initial drafts also, I was very high on star for a star, but the more I've played Prism, the more it's just, I need essentially everything to be synergizing with my hero ability. Otherwise, I'm not seeing the value there compared to just playing other heroes.
Exactly, right? When you're starting 8 life behind, especially.
Yeah, I think my journey has been, because I decked out a little bit with Prism when Dust Dawn came out, but you're right, I was so primarily focused on Icelander. I think it's been very interesting to see my journey because I feel like I've been retracing the footsteps of like you and Pheano and a lot of other people that have been engrossed in Prism for a while. It's like the lists are definitely convergent evolutioning. Which
it's funny too, right? Because you start at like I wouldn't call it like the 7 stages of grief, but you definitely have the 7 stages of Illusionist where you're like, okay, I like this card. This card must be good, right? It'd be good in other decks. And you're like, wait, well, actually, it's kind of not that great, but I've seen it be good in the past, but, well, we're a new hero with new weapons. And anyway, it's
Luminaris brain rot, as I like to call it.
Yeah, everyone's got to get to go through the Candyland, track here and get to the end. But I think we're all getting there. I think we're all starting to realize that there are aspects to the new Prism where, because we started so far behind, we do have to catch up. We do have to produce a lot more value than our opponents do, but luckily our cards are pretty good. So we're getting there. For sure. Yeah, just a contrast, right? So you start with like this, what's the most powerful, unique thing the hero can do, build from there to support that kind of like end game almost, really. Because you're even thinking about with Icelander, what's the last turn look like, right? Yeah. Whereas in my case, I tend to think about things more on the turn-to-turn basis. That it's like, what's the most powerful thing you can do? I think that's a very standard card game heuristic, right? But when I think of like Luminaris, right? Why do I want to be using Luminaris at all in the current world of Celestial Fury, not the original one, right? I'm thinking, okay, well, I can do a 2-card play, which is Pitch and Herald. I can do a 3-card play, which is 2 blues and a Herald, which then pays for Go Again, which then pays for Angel Swing if you have Empyrean Rapture and you hit, like all these conditionals, of course. And then it's always thinking, okay, what's the best I can do with 4 cards? What's the best I can do with 3? Best I can do with 2? Best I can do with 1? Maybe even 5? And then what's the worst I can do with those things? And how do I bring up that floor and bring up the ceiling without creating a ton of inconsistency? And that's normally where my iterations come from. So I think it's interesting that even if you take different approaches, you can still get to the same overall place as long as you're trying to think, how do I stay away from generics that everybody can run and that use better than I do? So good stuff there. Let's see here. So next question on the docket here is, what has been your opinion on Iris and its options? Is it fun, interesting, powerful? Are there notable matchups that feel good or bad to play in? Stuff like that.
Yeah, so the first thing is like Iris is undeniably powerful. I think if you play Iris, you play all the blue Spectra, and I'm currently on 5 yellow Spectra right now. I think 6 is probably more correct, but I really want to believe in Empyrean Rapture, so hard cuts have to be made somewhere. But if you devote the deck space to those slots, I think it's just very hard to lose an Iris matchup. It's one of the Spectra always has been kind of one of the most polarizing keywords in the games in terms of how opposing heroes can handle it. And if you're patient, you play multiple auras in the same turn, it's really hard for heroes like Bravo to outvalue you when you just have multiple weapons on the board. In terms of, so it's very powerful. I think it's kind of medium in terms of like play lines. You get some interesting decisions on like, when am I popping Mage Master Boots to commit this double aura hand? When is it correct to maybe swing out on all of my board versus playing a new aura? Because that is something unique compared to the old Luminaris, where it's just like, the more auras I have, the better. With Iris, you're never swinging more than 4 times, 4, 4, 4, 4, because you have to pitch each time for it, right? So once you hit kind of 3 auras on the board, or at least 3 valuable auras, you don't really want to be committing more. And I think that's kind of a trap I see a lot of Prism players fall into, is just, I'm supposed to put Spectra on the board, right? Is it fun? I think when you are in control of the game, it's very fun. But I think Iris is one of those polarizing not just in matchups, but also like in enjoyability, right? Because your opponent, there's a lot of games where you commit double auras on turn 0 and your opponent's like, I've lost, but it's going to take 12 turns to realize that the game is over. So it's fun for half the table at a time, but I don't know that it makes for like the most overall beneficial play experiences in Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that because, one, as a fellow wizard enjoyer and Kano occasional enthusiast, there's definitely the question of if there's a maximum amount of fun to be had at the table, certain classes like to take all of it and leave none of it for the opponent. And even at locals last night, we had our Kano player there, and I was paired into him round 1, and well, you know, he did a great job hanging in there, but you know, there's only so much you can do when Genesis comes down early, and even then, you know, I had another friend of mine playing in the next round on Dorinthia, and I was swapped over to the Iris package because I thought, okay, let's give it a try. Like, I've got no preference here. And then turned out that when you get a lot of auras down, it's pretty good. And the player had not been around during the original Prism days, so they didn't have that experience of saying, okay, how threatening are each of the auras? How do I contextualize them with the new cards and everything? So as they're saying, like, there's this polarity that comes from the matchups with Spectra strategies where you're like, well, if you let me do my thing, it's not going to be good for you. And if I don't get to do my thing, I'm really sad. So, you know, you have that kind of push and pull there for sure. And go ahead, sorry.
It's funny that you mentioned Dorinthia because I think that's one of the most extreme examples, right? It's just they can't build counters by swinging twice at your face if they want to respect your board state. And with a deck that has access to soul shields and figment flips or functionally D-reacts, it gets very ugly very fast.
Definitely. And one of the things that I noticed in my last round of the locals was I played against the Max. And the funny thing was that I had never played against Max before. I had not even really read the Bright Lights cards because I've been away from the game for a minute. I know that they do like random stuff like, oh, boost plus random effect of like, oh, this can't be blocked by equipment, this, you know, whatever. But I haven't like dug into the Bright Lights metagame. And so I'm reading every single card that's coming across the table at me. But I knew that it was kind of like an aggro nitromechanoid type deck. And I was like, okay, well, I was talking my opponent through my thought process on what I was going to board in because I run both Tunic and Rapture and Iris and Luminaris in my build. So I was thinking, okay, well, you're probably going to attack me a lot and I need to be able to block you. And I'm probably not going to be able to have time to set up tons of auras, but I will need to function off small card hands. And I do need to threaten some tempo angel flips to stay alive, probably. So I ran Rapture with Iris. And the cool thing about that whole situation was that I was able to not only leverage, right, the 1 to 2 or 3 auras I was able to get on board, right? Because once, like you're saying, once you have a couple auras on board, you don't get a lot of benefit out of extra ones. And so by only running the blue auras in my deck and by using Mage Master boots to try and get a couple out there early, because I knew that if I got popped, I was probably not going to have a turn anyway because I'm doing 2-card Herald throws, so the third one doesn't matter, third card, etc. But being able to leverage having 1 or 2 auras on the board, using a couple blues, and then ending on a Herald or something was very good. And like you're saying, I think a lot of Prisms are going to have to learn that you don't want to overcommit on auras because you do not have that exponential growth of value that we used to have with old Luminaris and like Ode to Wrath and just that snowballing advantage. So
yeah, Rapture Iris is interesting. That actually is a combination I haven't looked at very specifically yet, but I think in some matchups like Max that makes a lot of sense. He just doesn't really lead with small bits of damage, and so you probably can get a reasonable amount of value out of your angel wards.
Yeah, and the other big thing too is just like a lot of the Mechanologist cards that have come out in Bright Lights are not premium on damage, right? Even Twin Drive, right? It's only 5 damage for 2, which is good. 5 damage for 2 go again is really good, and that's an awesome card. But unless they're doing like a big high octane pistol turn, you can normally cover their stuff pretty well with your Heralds and even the blue auras as blocks. So, and if you ever make incidental spectral shields from like an early haze bending or stuff like that, you can get a lot of equity off of it. And the only negative then becomes, okay, well now I don't have easy access to multiple Herald turns. So if I have a full grip, it's really hard to use it, right? So what I think is interesting about the new Prism and the differences between Luminaris, and Tunic builds Luminaris and Empyrean Rapture, and Luminaris, Empyrean Rapture, and Iris, is that each of those decks has very different weaknesses and things you have to play around, but they have very different strengths on the matchups they're good into. And I think that being able to juggle between those, because of how modular the Heralds are as cards, because you can have to block or pitch, right? Same thing with the Herald, with auras, you can put the auras down or pitch with them, all that. I think there's a lot of room to explore there on optimizing every matchup with its own equipment suite, in a way. So let's see here. So speaking of Luminaris, what's been your experience with Luminaris so far? It's definitely the one you're gravitating towards from the list I've been seeing, so.
Yeah, so I think there was a lot of hubbub when Celestial Fury was spoilered about how, you know, this is a ghost of what Luminaris was, right? And that's definitely true. It obviously is not nearly as powerful as the original card. But when I tried to like objectively step back from it and say, all right, well, what are the play patterns here compared to original Lumi? And so if we look at like, specifically in the Herald plan, because what Celestial Fury, with it not letting you swing auras, there's like a clear dichotomy now between this is a Herald plan versus this is an Iris plan or an aura plan. But I think the Herald plan actually ends up being relatively similar. With original Luminaris, you pitched a yellow to play a 2-cost Herald that had Go Again, and then you pitch an additional card to play a second Herald. Now, of course, original Luminaris had the higher ceiling of if those Heralds were War Tunes that cost 1, you could fire off 3 in a turn. You kind of capped at 2 with Celestial Fury, but with Celestial Fury, you still end up pitching 2 cards to send 2 Heralds. And so I think kind of your bread and butter play patterns are largely unchanged. You're just missing out on kind of the really high ceilings of, oh, I have extra auras lying around there converting to damage, and I have triple War Tune, the Dream. But yeah, so I just kind of went back to my old Blitz lists, strangely, which were like very much Herald focused with the original Luminaris. And that's kind of what guided me originally in terms of just like, what are the ratios that I'm looking at here in terms of pitch versus aggro cards that maximize me getting to play these two? I've settled on around 28 blues. You don't need exactly 2 blues in every hand because you do have 9 War Tune Heralds in the deck, and War Tune double Herald hands still function off of 1 yellow, 1 blue. So you kind of have that insulation in terms of enabling your 4-card swings. But you kind of mentioned this earlier. I think Celestial Fury enables kind of like all of your medium-sized hands to function. You have a 2-card hand that swings 1 Herald, a 3-card hand that swings a Herald, threatening either to flip an Angel on the follow-up or to just arsenal that 3rd card, which I think is kind of a mind game that's very important. You can hold 2 red Heralds and 1 blue and swing the first one, and your opponent doesn't know that you have a red in hand. So you're threatening still, if they don't block out the first Herald, to flip that Angel. Whereas you're kind of getting like implied value out of that threat while still getting to arsenal a premium card. And of course you have the 4-card hand, which is kind of like what the deck ratios are optimized around, right? I think it's a fine card. It's no Luminaris, but it is very serviceable in this kind of Flesh and Blood 2.0 design world that we're finding ourselves in.
Definitely. I think the interesting thing about Luminaris for me is that, like you said, one of the first things we noticed was that, okay, Prism in Old World could do 2 Heralds a turn like 90% of the time.
Yeah.
And that's kind of it. Now she can do 2 Heralds a turn. So it's really not that different if you're on the Herald plan. The biggest difference, as you were alluding to, right, is that if I attack with Herald Protection and I hit and I get a Spectral Shield, I don't get to heal 1 and deal 1. Now I just heal 1, right? You definitely don't get the free value of all cashing in all of your auras that you managed to preserve, which was like my whole favorite part of Old Prism, right? It was that incremental advantage, and then it starts to snowball, and you could really hold on to the game with that. And now it's more like, okay, if you're on the Herald plan, you are committing to a Herald plan. There is no other thing that you're doing there, and it's so costly for you to even get Spectras into play because you only get 2 action points a turn. That's it. There are other cards that let you get further. Like you could even run Time Snap if you wanted, but that's hard. That's a tall ask, right? And so, you know, being able to have, we're still struggling with one card plays with Luminaris. I think it's basically impossible to get a good one out of that unless you're dropping like a passing or something. And even then, that's an investment for the future. It's like dropping an energy potion. But at the same time, our 2-card hands are unaffected. 3-card hands become a real thing, right? Being able to have 2 blues, like you're saying with a Herald, especially if you're on Rapture, you can threaten that Herald hit, goes to soul, flip the Angel for free, swing the Angel for 2 with the floating, and then you're looking at a pretty good rate. That's like 15 value, assuming you realize all the ward value, and then even more if you account for like whatever the Figment did when it came in. So, you know, this is pretty good. 3-card, 15 or 16 or whatever. But at the other end of it, if you play against someone who's got the damage prevention like Vincent or Kadachi's or like a Shuko or something where they can just really threaten your ward value, or let's say they pop your Phantasm, well, now you're behind on value, right? So now you have to even catch up even harder to be able to make up that difference. But the fact that we have the ability to do that with Rapture and the Luminaris to be able to make use of those hands, it's fantastic. And it lets us run so many blues, which is nice for pivoting, like you're saying, into the Iris plan, because the Iris is very pitch hungry. And in the past, it was always difficult to fit enough blues and yellows if you were trying to have Luminaris. You kind of had to pick between Luminaris and Iris. And I know that Prez, who was on the channel not too long ago, was a big Iris fan because he's really just a secret Guardian player and he just likes playing Guardian, but which is what Iris kind of is. But anyway, Luminaris contrasting with Iris is very interesting. Reality Refractor, though, is a card that I personally have been vexed by, just by it kind of splits the difference between having the small card hands where maybe you've got a lot of yellows or something, but we don't really have a payoff for yellow cards, and there's no go again, so you can't really put multiple auras into play and develop while attacking. So what are your thoughts on Reality Refractor?
I'm really low on Refractor personally. I've tried to understand the card multiple times. There are some very interesting lines that you can get out of Refractor. The most useful is kind of pitching 2 blues to play a 4-cost yellow instant aura and swing it off the Refractor for 5, which is not terrible. It's essentially like I'm trading 1 card for 5 value and I'm committing 2 cards to play my instant aura, which is what you want to be doing anyways. You want to be pitching a blue and activating Tunic to play those yellow instant auras, at least in the Iris plan. So it's like on rate in that scenario, or even above rate in that scenario. But you're right, with the lack of go again, you get really 1 good double aura turn in the game off of Mage Master Boots, or, you know, if you set up any play a blue Spectra plus a yellow Spectra. But what I've found with Reality Refractor is because it lacks go again, you can never have the kind of what I call like the maintenance turns, which is swing, 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 drop 1 Spectra at the end, so that I'm maintaining this status quo of like 2 to 3 Spectra on the board. You have to intentionally take turns between choosing to commit Spectra to the board or swinging your Reality Refractor and putting any amount of pressure on your opponent. And what I found is that if your opponent is respectful of Spectra, which, spoiler alert, if you're not a Prism player, you're playing against Prism, if there's a Spectra on the board, kill the Spectra. It's that simple. 95% of the time, it's correct to take the off turn, kill the Spectra. And if your opponent is disciplined and does that, I feel like you just fall behind very quickly on Refractor. So I'm not really sure where it fits into this equation in terms of like what is the deck archetype it even is supposed to be, aside from just all of the yellow auras.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because Reality Refractor is a romping club that's always activated, right?
Yeah.
With his damage, which
is fantastic rate.
Yeah, that's nice. However, 1 card per 5 damage. That's pretty good. But the problem is you had to invest cards to get there in the first place. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest reasons I always hated Library in Old Prism was that in the matchups you could use it in, you kind of didn't need it because you kind of already won. And then in the matchups that you didn't want it, it was a huge liability because you're spending a card, the pitch, the action point, and then you have to spend more cards later to even get the draw to make up your investment. And so if you think about it in terms of like, okay, what could I have done with those cards that I dropped? In a lot of cases, unless the matchup's extremely slow, you were better off just like attacking or blocking or doing something else, especially on the turn to the library where you have no pitch, no block. It's like, you know, that was a good Halo target. Let's just say that. My favorite one. But with Reality Refractor, it's a similar thing where, sure, you can drop a aura or a couple auras in a turn, or maybe even back-to-back turns. But then let's say your opponent spends a turn killing a Spectra. Let's say they have some counter tech and they have action point generation, and they can kill 2 Spectras, and you have 1 Spectra left, and you're like, man, I got 4 cards in hand. I can use one of them. You know, your Heralds don't have go again anymore. Rest in peace, right? Your Reality Refractor doesn't swing very efficiently. And even if you wanted to use a 4-card hand with Refractor, which is like, oh man, I'm running Angelic Descent, I'm so Gigabrain. It's like, well, okay, now you're choosing between swinging with a Herald and maybe getting a Figment or something, which is our whole game plan. And now you have to choose between using the Reality Refractor or an Angel, which is a Romping Club that does other stuff, right? So, you know, there's a lot of conflicting things for Prism specifically, and I feel like Reality Refractor was kind of funny in Dromai because Mara was showing me like her day one like spicy brew or whatever, where it was like use Furnace to get your 2 pitch right off of pitching your first red and the second red from your turn, and then you end on Reality Refractor because your burn them all can't be killed, right? And so that was a more I saw a lot of brandishes, I think there. It was kind of funny. But again, like
that is very spicy.
But that's the thing, right? Like you can use Reality Refractor and other Illusionists. Like the only Illusionist is not just Prism, and Dromai is not tied necessarily to Storm of Sandakai. So it'll be interesting to see if we get a new Illusionist potentially in the future, or a different, you know, archetype of cards that naturally have go again, kind of like the Spectral Prowlers, to see if maybe we could leverage our Reality Refractor on like a Spectral Shield game plan, because Spectral Shields are much easier to make generally, and then also we can normally protect them in some ways, whereas, you know, Spectras, if your opponent wants to kill them, they can, like you were saying with targeting them. And I will pump the brakes on saying always clear the Spectras, because yes, clearing Spectras is very good, but if the Prism is kind of in that mid to low range on health, you can kind of just kill them because they need to use cards to use the Spectras. So if they've spent like the past 3 turns, like, oh, I'm doing double Spectra every turn, and stuff that doesn't do anything, like Merciful Retribution on its own, Haze Bending on its own, Passing Mirage, and you're like, okay, that's great, but I'm Fi, and I've got Art of War, and I've got like a billion cards. I'm just gonna run you over. You know, that's something you got to keep in mind. So don't be led astray by us Illusionist players. We're trying to trick you. So
always psyoping.
That's right.
The first mistake was playing auras into Fi, but that's a whole different point.
As well, there are some believers of the Iris fatigue plan, so we'll see if that comes to fruition. But either way, now that we've kind of gone through all the weapons and stuff, we've definitely been through the gambit, like you're saying, of going through the journey of, okay, what's good in Prism, what's bad in Prism. This can't be bad, right? This couldn't be good. And then you eventually explore all what there is to explore. What do you feel that Prism is currently lacking or missing, and what stands in her way from being a front runner in the metagame, since she has struggled so far in making her presence felt?
Yeah, I mean, I think you got at this earlier, but the deck is just really missing solid 1-card hands. Like as good as it gets is dropping a Passing Mirage or a Pierce Reality, and those plays are fine. And I'm speaking specifically with Luminaris, of course. Those plays are fine, but it's just surrendering all tempo on that turn cycle to give your opponent as many cards as they want. And I think that ends up being quite dangerous in your long-term survivability when you only have 30 health. I've seen there are some lists that are like playing Snatch, I think, at 0 cost. Which Snatch is a great card. I think Prism struggles to blindly arsenal the top card of her deck a lot. Not only do you just have Figments that you literally never want to put in your arsenal, but your Blue Heralds are fine. Blue Triumph is like an acceptable arsenal, and Enigma Chimera is a fine card, but it's not something you're like actually happy putting in your arsenal, right? So in general, some way to convert your 1-card hands that's not reliant on your Tunic counter, because I think the best way to do it right now is pitching a blue to Awaken a Figment and Swing is kind of like your ideal 1-card hand, but it takes Tunic. And Tunic is a very high demand card. There's very many points in your turn cycles where you can use it, because it also turns a blue plus yellow pitch into a 6 resource hand, which then fuels your 4-card hands. Outside of that 1-card hand play, though, I don't know that there will ever be a clean answer to Dromai. So I'm not saying that like I expect us to have a favored matchup in a Dromai at any point. In which case, I think for Prism to be a front runner in the metagame, we need to see Dromai kind of fall off a little bit. I think she's very highly represented, and that matchup is 5%er if we're lucky. And so that's kind of where we're sitting in terms of like jockeying for meta position right now.
Yeah, I agree. I think it was funny because when New Prism, first came out, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we got some matchups that are kind of okay. We got some matchups that are kind of less good, but you can pivot. And then I'm like, oh, Dromai, Well, let's see if like a whole bunch of poppers helps. Oh, it doesn't. Okay, well, surely there's something here. Like LSS surely would not have given us an unwinnable matchup. Oh, well, anyway, so the and when we listened to the recent interview that Instant Speed with Flake got to do with all the developers like Chris Garian and Brian Gottlieb and James White, we got to hear from the horse's mouth that they're like, oh yeah, we figured Dromai is like really bad matchup, but like every hero's got bad matchups, so it's fine. Effectively was the synopsis there. And well, that's very true, but when Dromai is so popular and so consistently able to just obliterate Prism with minimal effort, you're just like, well, I'm gonna lose the gem, like just straight up.
Yeah.
You can have your locals, but if you're trying to go to a big tournament and survive through 14 rounds, and some of those are draft, but you get the idea. It's a tall ask to bring Prism, right?
Yeah, I do think karmically we're kind of in a funny situation here, because we were the nightmare for Oldhim for so long. It's just like, why would you bring Oldhim to an event? He has an auto loss to Prism. It's like, well, he has a 60%er into literally the rest of the field. And I think while Prism has the horrendous matchup in Dromai, I think the incentive to play her isn't quite there yet, because we're not favored into the rest of the field. I think with the switchboard, you have a very solid plan into most heroes, but Fi absolutely can still just explode and absolutely kill you. And so that's kind of like, even though why there's a lot of parallels between Prism and Oldhim in terms of their meta shares and having one polarized matchup, why they still had different representations in their respective metas in terms of people bringing them to events.
The funny thing too, karmically, is that when Dromai was released, Prism was still around, and that matchup was hell, because all of Prism's heralds don't care if they hit the face, they care if they hit. And so you could Erudition their dragon, draw 2, turn on Vestige or whatever, play more stuff, obliterate their whole board, Spectral Shields perfectly ping down every dragon, and they can't target your Spectral Shields, you can target their dragons, and they're just like, It was almost as bad as like a wizard matchup for Prism. So, we are now on the receiving end of that, because turns out in Illusionist Mirrors, the person who's got the ability to maintain board control by just efficiently answering all their opponent's permanents is generally the one that's going to overwhelmingly win. So it is poetic in that way as well. But I do think it's an interesting point that you bring up, like Oldhim and the meta share and stuff, because like you're saying, Prism has not yet had a good enough matchup spread to warrant bringing her over other decks, especially because of the popularity of Dromai. I think we had 2 Dromais in the top 8 of Worlds. Remember correctly?
It was Chance, and was there a second?
I don't remember the exact breakdown. I think there was like maybe 2 Fi, 2 Dromai, some other stuff. But the point is, right, Dromai was still scraping at the top of the...
Yeah, a very consistent top 8 deck, no matter what.
Yeah, and so if you sat down into a Dromai in top 8 as Prism, you'd be like, well, All right, let's prize split. You know, I don't know if you can offer that anymore. I don't know the state on those rules and everything, but anyway. Let's see here. So what are we missing, right? You know, what kind of mechanics, what kind of matchup spreads, or like what things that will we need in our matchups do you think to get there? Because right now we are waiting on some spoilers, right? We are waiting on potentially future sets that could give us more Illusionist and gas. Hopefully the set after heavy hitters gives us something good. So what are some ideas that you have that could nudge Prism to the middle of the pack / the upper end of the metagame, that maybe if Dromai's hopeless, what are some things that could help us in other matchups that you'd like to see or kind of be like on your wish list? Christmas is around the corner after all, so.
Christmas is in just a few days. So I have kind of two really big things on my wish list. We obviously can't get both of them. We've seen one of the spoiler cards, and it doesn't check out of the box, but I'm still hoping for Pheanos. But I have kind of like two pain points with Prism right now that I would love to see addressed. The first is when we're limited to just 2 action points on the turn, and we're so incentivized to play Phantasm cards more than ever before. Hold on, and let me backtrack even once more. If you compare Prism to something like Dromai plays a lot of regular attack actions and then ends her turn with Phantasm allies that stick around from turn to turn, and she can kind of really effectively play around not getting blown out by the Phantasm. Prism, on the other hand, is heavily incentivized to play attack actions, real cards from your hand that have Phantasm. And when you're limited to 2 action points maximum, you really can get blown out by that first popper on the turn. I would love to see something that kind of gives you an outlet to minimize how badly that hurts your turn. We have Phantasmal Footsteps, of course, which essentially says pay a resource, your turn isn't over. But you still have traded your 2 cards for your opponent's 1, because you pitched a card to play a Herald, presumably, unless it's warding off a tunic, but you know, we have to have some strong plays. I would love to see something along the lines of incentivizing your opponent to block multiple cards on Phantasms, even when one of those cards is a popper. In other card games, there are mechanics like Menace from Magic the Gathering, which says if you want to block this, you have to block with 2 things. I think something like that keyword translated to Flesh and Blood would be very interesting in the context of poppers. Like, your opponent still has the agency, they don't have to fully cover the 7 breakpoint if they give a 6 power. But I'm going to trade my 2 cards for you 2 cards here, and that's going to be a much more fair trade. And then the other thing that's kind of like even higher than that on my wish list is I would love a guaranteed way to get full value out of our angels. Because right now, I can't run Rapture into Katsu because he throws 1 Kodachi at me and I can't block it efficiently, and my Soraya pops, and it's like, I essentially just downgraded my value on hit from my last Herald from like 100% to 25%, which is really brutal, right? And so some kind of either repeated effect or an instant from hand that allies you control lose ward or something to that effect is just like, if you want to kill this angel, you have to actually deal 4 damage to it. I think would go a long way in improving the hero, and it would also make a lot of cards make more sense. I still don't get the joke with Bologna about like putting +1 counters on all of your angels, because you just, with the modern card pool, you never really have more than 1 angel out at a time. I don't know. What does your wish list look like?
Yeah,
or
so,
what do you think about these ideas?
So the Menace idea is one that I had a while ago, and I think I was the first person I ever saw bring it up as a potential avenue to help fix Phantasm, because I like you, I feel the same pain points, right? One, we play Prism because Prism's cool and her card artwork is nice. Yes. And, you know, we want to have our nice, pretty Marvel Angels on the board for as long as possible, like Dromai gets to do with all of her Ashwings and all of her dragons and everything. But LSS was like, oh, allies are kind of toxic. Oh, but what if we put ward on them so that you can attack face and also clear dragons, because maybe you're, you know, a class like even Wizard, like Kano, who literally cannot interact with Dromai's dragons at all. And at least Dromai or at least I know the Angels can be destroyed by Kano's Arcane, even if he struggles to win the matchup. He can at least feel like he's doing something, right? Whereas, you know, but then like you're saying with the Kodachis, it makes your Angels extremely fragile to the point where you feel like you shouldn't even run the cards that enable them, because you're like, okay, well, what's the point, right? And that feels bad when they're legendary, permanent, angel, ally. You know, like these are these big, powerful words that in any other game, like if you think of Magic the Gathering or, you know, whatever other card game, an angel is like this powerful, like heavenly, you know, concept where you get to, you know, wield this powerful being to, you know, have this fantasy as like this invoker, summoner type character. And when that turns out to be, you know, a gust of wind or a tiny little, you know, acorn being flicked across the map, just kind of, you know, knocking them down, you're like, oh, okay. You know, that doesn't feel good, right? It doesn't feel rewarding when you have to put so much effort into putting your Angels into play, right? Because we have to throw a Phantasm, which is risky, hit with it, which is not guaranteed, and then you have to have the equipment or resources to flip it, and then swing with it and have go again. And that's a lot of ifs. So, you know, yeah, that's not something you can really plan on if you're caring about winning the game. So I do agree that having a way to reduce the vulnerability of Angels would be fantastic. I don't know what that would look like in a fair way, because I do like how Ward exists on the Angels. It gives your opponent counterplay to what could potentially be very powerful cards. The problem is that it costs soul to attack with them for anything beyond being a romping club. And the fact that, you know, just having a couple romping clubs on the board that can be destroyed, where you have to pay soul for on-rate value, because soul is generally worth 2. If you think about Bolton Hero Power with the Go Again, or Social Cataclysms costed that way, that kind of thing. You know, 2 Arcane's nice, but that's really hard for Prism to get soul. She can't just charge. She doesn't have any Lumina, you know, hypercharge her soul turns. And then we all looked at soul food.
You're not a believer in soul food?
We looked at soul food, and then looked elsewhere, because turns out a 4-card do nothing is not good for Prism. Like, she doesn't benefit enough from the soul currently for that to be a valuable play. But the potential is there, obviously. But the fact that the Angels on attack effects are so weak means that there's really not a lot of incentive for you to summon them and attack with them and spend that soul, because then you're like, okay, well, every soul that I use is a figment I'm not flipping, which is generally how it goes, right? Because to even flip the Angels, you have to spend a soul. So, and your Heralds only provide 1. So unless you're getting 2 soul per attack or per thing you're doing, you just never have enough to even use the on attack effects. So it's just very costly. And so we could either see a multiplication of the on-attack effects or a reduction in the on-attack effects cost. And I think that would go a long way at making them feel more impactful, even if we never get to keep them around, because...
You know, we did see kind of like some rules technology debuted in Bright Lights, which was the reclassification of tokens existing outside certain zones or under certain cards, with Max's token hyperdrivers being able to be put under Nitro Mechanoid. I wonder if we could see something that kind of like generates token cards that go into Soul to, like you said, enable those extra attacks or those extra attack triggers without having to spend real cards on them.
That'd be nice.
That's kind of an interesting idea, and I feel like the game has just recently set up the framework to allow something like that to happen.
I was also thinking, because when you were like into the thinking phase, I'm like, oh, maybe you're going this way. I was thinking, what if the Angels could have soul, right? And then every time they have soul, instead of like being destroyed, they spend a soul and then they stay around. And I'm like, oh, that'd be sick.
I do think if you want to, because I mentioned earlier, like, oh, just Angels lose the ward until end of turn. That's probably too strong in the context of like Fab Design 2.0. But what I would love to see is a repeatable way to say, like, the next time you would take damage this turn, instead mark that much damage on target ally you control, which essentially is just like guarantees you get the full 4 value out of your Angel. And if they don't actually deal 4 to you, the Angel doesn't die.
Funny thing about that, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So a long time ago, before Everfest was spoiled, I tried to do some like predictions on what we might get, because that's the first time we ever had new Illusionist cards after Monarch.
Right.
And I was wondering what we could get. And one of the things that I was hopeful for, because back then tank Prism was my whole thing. Spectral shields were your permanents that you could protect, whereas because they had ward 1, right, and then you had Spectras which people could destroy, and then you could block, right, with the Herald. So that was kind of the trifecta. But then when I was thinking like, okay, well, if I want to keep a glistened up Spectral shield around, I have to block, and sometimes you can't block. But what would be a cool way to maintain your ward permanents without straight up losing them? And I came up with a card that was basically like, it was like an instant and you'd play it, and anytime that you'd be dealt damage this turn, instead you lose that much life, right? And so the concept was, okay, yeah, I still take the damage, but you don't get your on-hit effects and I don't lose my ward, right? That was kind of the nice thing. And I do think that an effect like that is actually pretty balanced, because again, you can just straight up die, you know, even if you're turning off like a lot of on-hit effects. But if their on-hit effects are just damage, then they're happy with that. But then you're happy with that because you actually have some agency in deciding, okay, do I want to preserve my permanents or do I want to preserve my life? And I think that that's an avenue that they can go. I do like your idea of redirecting damage, and I think it could be a similar thing to Yoji, right? Or I think it's Yoji, right? Where he can just say, oh, if I would take damage, I put it on someone else, or I choose where your attack target is. I think that would be good as well. Because then it would be, I think rules-wise, right? If I change the attack target to my ally, then they still get their go again, they still get their on-hit effects, they still get all their good stuff. But if it was like redirecting the damage, I don't know if it worked that way exactly, but off the top of my head, but I would like something like that.
I am not a judge. I'm not a rules expert. I just know what cards are cool when I play with them.
Yeah, so that would be cool. I definitely want more ways to either interact with the angels so that they're not just meat shields that pop, and I would like more ways to keep them around if possible, because at the end of the day, I really don't think Ward and the Angels is necessary. They cost to attack with, and they cost soul to get like an effect out of. Whereas Dromai's dragons attack for 0 and then have on-hit effects for free. So there's a very big difference in the snowbally nature of them, especially because you can only attack 2 angels a turn. I personally thought that they could have been weapons without Ward, and that would have been cool. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah, I mean, they also cost soul just to make. Yes. I don't know how many times my opponent has like spent their action point on turn 0, and I drop a Figment and I go to flip it, and I'm like, I don't have any soul.
Like, that is not how this works. Oh no.
Yeah.
The other thing, like the Menace thing, I really want Phantasm to require thought from both sides of the table. The biggest pain point that I have for playing Illusionist classes in general is that if my opponent has a 6, their thought process, their decision tree is, okay, do I need to kill them with this next turn? No, I just get a free 2 for 1 or better on their turn. Yay me, I'm so smart, right? And on the other hand, if you are the person who has no poppers in your deck because you are playing a wizard or a warrior or something, and you see, you know, Phantasm attack after Phantasm attack where you're like, these are all better cards than other people play, and I have no counterplay to this. That also feels terrible. And then on the other side of the playmat, right, because if you've got the people that are pro Phantasm Popper, the people that are anti-Phantasm Popper, they have their own dichotomy. But then on the other side, you're playing the Illusionist, and you're like, man, I got cards in my hand right now, and it would suck if I didn't block with these, and then I get blown out. Like, this is really bad. And then, you know, it feels bad, right? It feels bad, and part of the risk reward is there, and that's fun. Like the feast or famine, like high stakes gameplay is a lot of fun. It's very exciting, or it can be. But one of the best cards I think ever printed for Illusionist, design-wise, not even just power level, although it is very powerful, is Mirage and Metamorph. Anybody that played during Everfest Prism days knows about Mirage and Metamorph, and even people that play against Dromai, because it is an efficient attack, right? It pays for its Phantasm with 2 extra damage over a critical strike, which again, no one's running critical strike in CC, you know, as a generic good card. So Metamorph's not overpowered because of its damage. The reason it was so powerful is because it got free go again off Luminaris naturally, and if you popped it, it gave you a copy of an aura you control, which you could instant speed into play to get an extra Arclight or an extra Genesis, which kind of was very good. And so it kind of is all right. The thing is, though, is that a lot of people were like, oh my god, this card's so good, I can't just pop it. I'm like, yeah, I'm giving you a whole card. Like, yeah, you have to think if you want to pop it or not. It's not just auto, like, lol, you know, slap it down. And so I'm hoping that we get more cards that either like we were talking about with the Menace keyword, where it's like if you want to block this, you have to use 2 cards from hand. Like you can't just throw that 1 card down. You can still pop it. You can still end my turn. You can still mess me up, but you can't get such a overwhelming advantage over getting, upwards of 5 free block on a card, and ending my turn, right? That's really feels bad. While also, if you think about the flip side, it's like, okay, well, if you don't care about my damage, you don't have to block this. There's no debilitating crush effect or anything that you're gonna have to worry about. There's no red in the ledger. It's just some damage and positive value for me. So you then, as the opponent, have choices of, do I use armor? Do I use cards to block this? Do I care? Do I pop it with multiple cards? Stuff like that. I think that would be great. But then on the other side, I want to explore at Phantasm more. I think Phantasm's super underexplored right now because with Frightmare, right? Frightmare is a really cool card conceptually, right? Where it's like, oh, you pop me? Well, now I'm sending something even bigger at you that you're gonna have to deal with. The problem is that you can only play Frightmare if that happens, and it doesn't block. So, and it costs, and it's red.
Not block?
It could be a blue. It could be a blue 0 block, and that'd be fine. It'd be fine. It'd be balanced. I think.
Why is it card not block?
Yeah, it's like so close to being playable, but Frightmare is a cool design in the sense that we could get Phantasm cards that are even better than they're supposed to be, but maybe they have this really debilitating downside. So like for instance, Mirage Metamorph has an effect when it's destroyed, aka via Phantasm. But it gives you a positive effect, right? Oh, like it gives me a copy of something I already have. But what if, right, we had a card that was like 13 Phantasm for 3, and you're like, whoa, that's really big. But then it's like, oh, if this is destroyed, I lose as much life as I have Phantasm attacks in my graveyard. And you're like, oh, that's risky. Oh, but hey, if it works, it's really good. And so that becomes this thing you can play around. Your opponent's like, oh, I cannot let Passing Mirage stay around. I cannot let that go through. I would love that. I would love more either higher risk, higher downside, higher risk, higher reward, or, kind of make them normal rate like Metamorph, but give us a very good on pop effect to make your opponent actually think about popping it. And then I think Phantasm has more room for play with that.
Yeah, I think you're getting at the real crux of the issue at the end there is that on pop effects it's just Metamorph, right? I think that's the only card in the game that has one.
No, a lot of cards in Everfest that are bad happen as well.
Sure. Yeah, the 3 for 8 that on pop you get a special shield is like fringe playable, but it also is a wounded bull in a Fize world, and that's not where you want to be.
Coalescence
Mirage doesn't have a pop effect.
It's true. It
play
effectively does not. Why does it not just play it from Arsenal?
It's a great question.
And then Veiled Intentions is a card that I love the thematic of the turning normal attacks into illusionist attacks. You've got things like Symbiosis, Phantasmal Symbiosis, you've got Veiled Intentions, you've got Phantasmify and Transmogrify. And Transmogrify is fantastic. I made like a whole Dromai deck with like Belittle and Fractal Replication. All that was great and not good, but fun. And I hope that we can get some more actual synergy out of like turning things into illusions later, but that's probably going to be more of a draft or for fun thing. But Veiled Intentions kind of blows because turns out drawing 1 card off a pop means that you donated a 3 cards your opponent's won, so you're still only down 1 card, but you're still down cards. So
still down, yeah.
And you're over-investing in the 1 attack, blah, blah, blah. It's always better to do Spirits of Reality instead, blah, blah, blah. Okay.
But Phantasmified CNC, let's go again.
True.
Paris days.
It just, you had to pitch 2 cards to do that because yellow doesn't pay for both. So it was kind of, Either way, I think the general point where we're at is that we want Angels to feel good because they don't. And we want Phantasm, because we're so reliant on Phantasm, because the only way we really get Soul, the only way we get Angels into play is through Phantasm, which means that if we're playing against Guardian, we're playing against Brute, we're playing against heavy popper decks in general, that's like not happening. And we want to make that a bit more engaging because like right now, Celestial Reprimand was something printed in Dustal Dawn, which kind of helps get through our Phantasms. But the problem is like, if I have a Guardian that blocks me with Spinal Crush, it just, no matter, unless I have 2 Celestial Reprimands in my hand, like a red and a yellow, it's still not enough, right? So it can be very frustrating to try and build your deck to answer these problems, but the answers that are there don't actually end up working. So hopefully we get something like a repeatable legendary equipment or something that's like a way to either strip Phantasm proactively like a Dreamweaver's, or give us like an attack reaction type of, reduce the attack of a blocker or something by 1 or something like that. That'd be really nice.
The one last thing I think that we haven't touched yet that could really help Prism is some meaningful disruption. One of my pet cards is, which I think you're also high on right now, is Phantasmaclasm, which I really, really, really want to believe in that card. I think there's an unbelievable amount of implied value in the look at their hand, bottom a card, draw a new card. Because not only does it give you a little bit of insulation versus decks that have a handful of poppers, because if you bottom a popper from their hand, the odds that they draw 1 off the top is quite low compared to drawing 1 in 4. But also, when they don't have the popper and you're like playing versus Phi and you take Phi's only blue, you just decreased Phi's damage output on the next turn by like 4 or 5 points of implied value, which is massive. Right now, I'm not playing Plasm, just because the 3 cost kind of locks you into like, this is my 2-card hand when I draw it. And I, talking about the most powerful things that the hero can do, and really wanting to try to maximize 2 Phantasm attacks per turn when I can. But even if we just got like a 2-cost, 1-point downshifted Plasm, I would be absolutely all over it. The dream.
It's funny, a long time ago, when I was first building for Prism, I put Phantasmaclasm in the deck because, again, we had so few cards, it just made sense. But I remember loving the cards so dearly because of how powerful the hand scramble was that I went on record saying that I would play this card if it did 0 damage. 2 cards, like, I just want to mess up my opponent's hand because this is so powerful in some cases, right? Like you're saying, it can just strip your opponent's ability to play the game.
Kind of interesting, Lost in Thought.
The problem with Lost, but I do like Lost in Thought. I've tried it in Prism, but it doesn't let you do any card. It's only actions. So, or I think maybe even just attacks. So it's really, So it's, if it was any card, it'd slap 3 of those bad boys in there, call it a day. But unfortunately, a lot of the cards that you want to be bottoming are power cards like Art of War. It's things like Bloodrush Bellow. It's things like, Nitromechanoid, things that Lost in Thought does not touch. So, not as, and it doesn't block 3, blah, blah, blah. But point is, Phantasmaclasm, fantastic card. I do think it is one of the best things that Prism can do. Dromai struggles to play that card because it's red. Prism runs tons of blues. A 2-card 9 that also destroys your opponent's turn. Pretty good.
And I think that's important to note, though, is like, Plasm has been historically underrated just because the 2 Illusionists before this, their resource base just couldn't support it. Original Prism was incentivized to play too many yellows, and if you have to pitch 2 cards to play Phantasmaclasm, the rate isn't there anymore. Dromai just can't. She doesn't play blues. With Advent of Thrones and Awakener's Soul, we finally have a deck that like, oh, this is a deck that's half blue. It's really good.
Plus it eats buffs like Pierce Reality really well. Right, because it's already at that on rate 9 damage attack, so becoming 11's like, oh, well now you have to give me your whole hand or this hits you. It doesn't have an on hit, but like, that's fine. Also, one other fun thing I've been thinking of, because I've been running Plasm continuously, like I know you've been kind of on and off of it, but the more I play it, the more I'm like, if I see my opponent has a bad hand, I kind of just want to let them have it, but Plasm is not optional. It is a mandatory sync, which means that it's not, if it was optional, to live in that world. And I do think, I hope that Illusionist in general gets more effects like Lost in Thought and Phantasmaclasm, where we get to use information and be a bit trickier with what we're doing rather than just slamming points on the table. But I think that the main benefit of having Phantasmaclasm still on the list is that it makes me want to run Talisman of Tides, because it's a blue, it has go again. So on multiple blue hands where you're like, oh crap, I can't really do anything with this, you can drop your Talisman of Tides, and then later when you do drop the Plasm, you're like, oh, now this is just 3 for 9, like 3 resources for 9. I delete a card from your hand. And that has been in the back of my mind. It's still a 0 block, Talisman. It's still, you have to draw it, but I've been thinking more and more about it just because that reduces all of the downsides of Phantasmaclasm, and then at that point you're trading card for card, right? And the talisman gives you even more insulation from like that one popper, so they never draw it because they always draw it when I play it. They're like, here's my 6 that I drew into off of Plasm. Thanks for that, friend.
Talisman is spicy. I have not played that card in a while. I have played that card at competitive events before, but it was in Briar versus Starvo. With the Plasm effect, that's pretty interesting. I'll have to think about it.
Yeah, what has to get cut, right? I think the problem so far for me has been that I like to have very clean ratios in my decks. I'm very averse to running like 1-ofs and 2-ofs unless you can tutor, or unless you only ever want to see 1 or 2 per game, and you're only running 2 so you can see it more often. Something like Energy Potion back in the day, right? But so I would be thinking like, okay, if I have 3 Plasm, well, one Talisman is probably enough, but then you're not going to see it very often, so what's the point of running it? Unless you're, again, in those long matchups or something, which you're generally not going to be in. And if you do the 0 block, there's all these things you have to think of, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to see where Prism gets with whatever new cards come out, because you need a lot of blues, right? I like to run 30 blues because I want to, on average, no fancy hypergeometric calculator math, because that also gets kind of noodly once you even start thinking about after the first turn, right? Like, okay, well, on average, I get 2 blues a hand, 1 red, 1 yellow. We're chilling. That pays for our War Tunes almost always. That pays for our Double Heralds a lot of the time. We can block and go to a 2-card hand, Arsenal. We have some good options there instead of like being on 15 blues or lower than 30-ish, because you're on like 28, so that's whatever it is, so similar. So what comes out, right? Can you cut Blue Herald? It's like, well, Tenacity Blue kind of blows. It blocks, and
it's blocked. It's a light card, and it
goes to Halo. It goes to Halo.
It checks all of the boxes, but
kind of blows.
Kind of doesn't do anything else.
Yeah, and so that could be something. Like, I'm not on Warmongers, for instance. I don't own them and don't want to buy them in Rainbow Foil because my entire deck needs to be matching.
That is a problem.
And at the same time, it's also has no go again. It has the same exact problems that Passing and Pierce do. So realistically, like, I'm not that big on it. So
I mean, I see Diplomacy as it's very much a called meta shot. We just saw Azalea win a tournament and get 2nd place at a tournament in the last weekend at the Realm 10K and 20K. And so there's just always kind of like those cycles in games where like nobody plays the hate cards, the deck that isn't hated out wins, everybody plays the hate cards, the deck doesn't win, nobody plays them anymore. But I think Diplomacy as a very reasonable floor of just being a blue block 3, which is like, okay, so we've checked 2 of the boxes, and then it also enables your 1-card hands that I talked about earlier. Only in specific matchups, mind you, but in those matchups, that 1-card hand is frequently stronger than your 2 or even 3-card hands. So it's just like, I can totally see like playing the 3rd Enigma Chimera over them, and maybe Heart of Fyendal. I'm kind of low on that card right now just because the deck can already draw hands that do nothing with Figments, and so drawing another card that potentially does nothing is probably not worth the downsides of not blocking or having a card that does anything offensively, even though you can pretty consistently gain a few life from it.
Yeah, I think another card that I'm not gonna justify purchasing is Heart of Fyendal. Right? Fables in general are often very well balanced in this game, which I'm very thankful for. It's very nice that we do not have to cram in like 6 super expensive rare cards in our deck to be competitive. Obviously, Icelander really benefited from the flexibility of Heart because of all the reasons that makes it good. But Prism, right, like you're saying, it's a lot harder to actually leverage that in a lot of cases. We have a lot less free time with it. So it is a one-of, right? You're like, is this even reliable? When do you want to see it? Is this going to be worth it? Enigma Chimera is something that I've been very surprised to see in lists, and I know that a lot of lists that you've been floating around have had it in there because it's just a blue block 3 that sometimes attacks for 6 with no on.
Right.
Which isn't bad.
It's just like
But
It's just the next best blue block 3 we have access to, right? Like, it's not a herald, it doesn't have the on hits, but it is a respectable rate for your blue card. So I don't know what I would be playing over it, right?
yeah, I mean, I think in the hybrid plan, I think you can afford to run Coalescence Mirage Blue probably instead, because you're just losing the 1 damage. But if they pop it and you're going to arsenal the aura anyway, you can at least get it into play. Again, not great, but you know, it's fine. I think kind of you don't want to run either. I think that the amount of block we have with heralds is fine. I think that if you're running, you know, 15 or so red 3 blocks, you're running 15 at least blue 3 blocks, and then maybe you're running like 9 yellow 3 blocks effectively. If you can count Soul Shield in that, because it turns the other stuff into like effectively 3 blocks.
It's
I think you can afford.
Yeah,
I think. Yeah, exactly. I think you can afford to run some more of these like Talisman of Tides types cards, and I was thinking even like Lead the Charge Blue might make sense, because a lot of the times when you have you want to have 2 blues in hand, because if they don't block you, you want to be able to capitalize on it on that turn by attacking the angel and all that, because then you can generate like a ponder off erudition, whatever it is. But if you draw a blue off a ponder and that blue is a herald, you're sad. If the blue you draw off a ponder is a aura, it's hard to get it into play. And if you have a big hand, it's hard to use all the cards. But Lead the Charge Blue gives almost every herald the ability to get go again effectively, but it's better because it's not go again, it's an action point. So you don't get popped by Phantasm. It doesn't matter as much. And you can then actually go wider on a turn where it's like, oh, I had maybe 2 blues in hand, 2 War Tune Heralds, I have an angel on the board. Okay, now my Lead the Charge, well, I guess that doesn't work. You have to have 1 2-cost herald, but it'd be like War Tune into a 2-cost herald off of Lead the Charge, and then you could still swing your angel with pitch, and maybe you can even with Tunic or something, the math works out to where you can get 3 attacks in a turn off of the Lead the Charge.
No, I like that a lot, because even just the floor of like being a blue that you're happy to arsenal off the ponder is really convincing. Actually, I'm gonna have to try that out for sure.
Yeah, because things like we have so many things contesting our action point. So like Warmongers conflicts with everything, which is again why I'm not jumping to go get the card. But Lead the Charge, Talisman of Tides, these things have go again. They are good things to throw into Arsenal because they will have value later. And if they don't, well, I mean, they're still blues. You can just pitch them because we don't have a real weapon. It's totally fine to have blues that are not like great cards, because we can just pitch them. If we don't use them for pitch, we're not having to turn anyway. And so if all we have left is a blue in our hand that we can't or don't want to block with, well, we really should want to arsenal it, aka like a talisman or like a Lead the Charge or whatever it is. So and Lead the Charge blocks, whereas Angelic Descent does not. So that's another reason I don't want to run Angelic Descent blue. Things like Angelic Wrath are also interesting. Angelic Wrath gives you a bit of insulation on if they block out your herald, right? So if they cover it with like armor and 2 cards because they're like, oh, they don't have a popper, you're throwing a Triumph at them for 7, and you have that second blue, which you wanted to use to, you know, flip Swing Angel. But if you go over the top with Angelic Wrath, well, all of a sudden you hit anyway. You get your flip off of an Empyrean Rapture if you need it, or if it's good in the matchup, and then you at least have the soul for later. You have the Figment Search, and then you can get that out of them. And again, if you draw too many of them or you don't want to use it, you can arsenal it. It's totally usable later. So I think there's more room to explore with that, and letting go of the control, like Jesus take the wheel on the block values, because at least in my experience so far, if all you do is try to block his Prism efficiently, you need to catch up, right? Like we don't have a lot of disruption, right? We don't have a lot of ways to slow our opponent down. And blocking is inherently unfavored into attacking, so I think that while it feels good to have as many 3 blocks and 4 blocks as possible in the deck, we might need to clip some of those to unlock some other potential, but we'll see.
Interesting.
But yeah, anything else that you want to touch on before we wrap up?
I don't have anything else specific. I think that was a really interesting conversation. I definitely have come away with some cards to try in my lists, like Blue Lead the Charge. I'm kind of excited about that one.
Yeah, well, again, thanks for coming on the channel. It's been a pleasure having you. I know that I like to write my little mini dissertations in the Prism chat quite a lot, and so I always enjoy talking through different ideas because, again, I don't claim to be the authority on anything. I just like talking about the game, and I do like exploring all the crazy jank and mad science that we can all get up to together and put our brains together and figure out stuff for the community. So thanks again for coming on the channel.
Well, you know, I can never resist building a C-tier hero, so I'm always down. I had a blast. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, thanks. And thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure to keep your eyes on the On Hit Effect YouTube channel, which is where you can find Rhea. Keep your eye on Pheno Black's YouTube channel, where we're going to get our spoilers soon later today. And also keep your eyes on this channel for more Illusionist content in the future. Take care and have a good day. Peace.